Thank you all for joining us today. This will be the first webinar in a series. In the following webinars, we will have guest speakers who are former CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, existing executives from some of the largest organizations in the world, some of the 100 best in the world, from different countries, many of which are our mentors, and some notable entrepreneurs which will share their different perspectives and some of the lessons they've learned throughout their super successful careers and how mentorship played a role in that. So stay tuned for our future webinars. This webinar is pre-recorded, so if you have any questions as we go along in the webinar, feel free to include them in the chat and we will answer them live in the Q&A session immediately following the webinar. So feel free to save any questions you have for the end or to write them down in the chat as we go. The first webinar is based on overcoming obstacles with a focus on mentorship. So Don is going to share how using acceptance, attitude, humor, perspective, not blaming others, constant learning, desire to improve, and never giving up led to his overwhelming success. These are tactics he's used throughout his career and life when facing adversity, and he'll share how that played a role in his success. I think you'll find his story very interesting and unique, as I have while getting to know Don. Overcoming these seemingly insurmountable personal and professional challenges has been, there's a lot of lessons to learn within that. So by way of background, and I don't want to give away too much of his story, but Don ultimately became a CEO of a publicly traded company before the age of 40. You should know that there are about 4,300 CEOs in the United States at any given time. And at the time, there was less than 10 or a dozen or so which were under the age of 40. So that in itself is quite a feat. But when I share when Don shares some of the obstacles he's overcome on the way, I think you'll be that much more amazed. Before I introduce him, I'd like to share the unusual conditions in which we met. So a few years ago, I looked back at my career and I noticed that I had constant improvement along the way using personal development and self-help books, right? But I noticed where I took a big quantum leap forward was when somebody else was helping me. So if you think back to a time where you took a big leap forward, you may notice that you had somebody helping you along the way, whether they had the title of mentor or not. I wanted to take another giant leap forward, and in order to accomplish that, I was going to need to leverage the expertise of somebody who had the top level of experience and success. So Don and I were both looking at the time for a mentor and mentee. Both of us were frustrated with trying to meet somebody that we were looking for through the traditional networking venues, So we resorted, like everybody else today, to looking on the apps. So we met on a local networking app, which helped us connect, and he almost passed me over for his mentee. And Don was looking for somebody who was ambitious, young professional with high integrity that came from a tough background, maybe one that shared his Latino roots. He felt at the time that I may have had it a little too easy growing up because I'm white. But fortunately, my persistence prevailed, and Don agreed to bring me on as his mentee. I feel so fortunate for having received the mentorship from Don because of how much I've grown in the process. He shared different perspectives, different way of looking at and approaching challenges, sharing lessons that he's learned along his way, as well as giving me feedback on current challenges I had as a VP of sales, as well as an entrepreneur. He also walked me through many of the challenges he was facing, asked me what I would do in the situation, and gave me feedback on how he would approach those challenges. His mentorship has been absolutely invaluable for me, both personally and professionally. Don, after our many discussions, And I want to thank you for being very vulnerable and sharing your story with me. I know that you haven't shared your story for over 50 years, and hadn't until just last year at a convention with me. Why have you decided to wait so long, and why share your story now?
Well, probably the first reason is embarrassment, honestly, Will. And the second one is I probably wouldn't think people would believe me. It's probably the reason I didn't go to Dr. Phil unless it was going to be a session on world's biggest liars. So, but eventually one day I was sitting in my office and just thinking about how fortunate I was to be this young kid from central Pennsylvania who was lucky enough to have received really outstanding mentorship from some of the best business minds in the country. And so I really started thinking about how I could create not only the ability for myself to be able to pass on the sage advice that I had received from these great business minds, but how I could create a platform to be able to share that advice not only to one, myself to to another person, but how I could share that advice to many people. So I went about calling some people. I made a list of CEOs that I knew, and it was a larger list than I expected. It was about 250 people. And I made a bunch of calls, and they were really pretty notable CEOs and notable entrepreneurs. And without exception, they all agreed that they would participate. And then when I also told them that I would give them 2 scholarships each that they could provide to people who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford it, they were all so excited about that. So that's how I got started.
I know I've enjoyed our relationship. So, what's the purpose of our webinar today?
Well, I'm just glad that you've enjoyed that, and I just hope you've gotten out as much of it as I have, because I've really enjoyed our relationship as well. Well, essentially, the purpose of the webinar is to talk about the obstacles, and not only how you overcome those obstacles, but with a particular focus on the mentorship piece. Those are really the two main focuses. But in order to talk about that, we're going to have to do something which is one that I really hate to talk about, which is really my background. And the only reason I really hate to talk about it is I am clearly not looking for any pity or sympathy or anything like that. And as you'll see as we talk a little bit further, I'm a big person about talking about perspective, keeping things in perspective, in their proper perspective. So I don't care how poor you are, I don't care how rich you are. You always find somebody richer, you always find somebody poorer. So it's important to keep things in their proper perspective. I'm not looking for any pity or sympathy at all, but it is important to keep things in those perspective. The other thing that's important is optics. So when I talk about my childhood, you'll see, like in a couple of these pictures that I talk about, us as children. So there's a picture of me and my couple of my siblings with my father in front of an elephant. We're at Disneyland out in California. You take a look at that picture and you think, oh, look at that cute family, and there's really nothing wrong with them. Or another picture of me and my sisters and my brother, where, again, you take a look at us and we look at like nice, sweet little kids. But what you don't see there is, my mom was an alcoholic and a drug addict. And what you don't see there is that she had taken us to California, where we lived for about a year in the Watts Compton area. And for those of you who don't know, Compton and Watts and Cudahy, where we lived, is probably in like maybe a few mile radius. It's all South Central LA, and it's all about the same kind of culture. It's not at that time, it was probably the worst place to live in the country. There was no worse place to live. And I really hate to use the word sexual abuse, but let's just say there were some bad things that really happened to us, which included, and I know people don't even like to say this, but some bad sexual things that happened to us, incest. My mom's boyfriend at the time was into child pornography. We went to sex and drug parties. where we'd walk to school. My sister and I were held up at knife point to our throats, to take our lunch money. And that made your decision very, very simple. Either you gave them your lunch money or your lunch tickets or your life. And this was all before the age of 7. You know, my sisters and I had this little scheme where my sisters would go in and create a diversion in these little convenience stores while I did the stealing. But what's important to know is I wouldn't steal cigarettes. I wouldn't steal candy. I would steal things like crackers and cheese and food, that kind of thing. So even by poor people's standards, we were poor, but even still, we knew people much poorer than we were. So the other thing I think it is important to note that we find humor in a lot of these situations, which is another way to cope. And we'll talk about that a little later on as well. The other thing I think it's important to note is I'm just going to talk about myself. I'm not going to talk about my sisters, my younger brother, who is 4 years younger than me. So at that time, he was 2 or 3 years old. He doesn't even remember these things. So people might remember the Rodney King riots in the 96, 97 timeframe. But we lived in the Watts, Compton area when the original riots took place, which was in the 69, 68, 69 timeframe, which is when we lived there. So, and by the way, I just want to make this comment as well. My mother just a few weeks ago celebrated her 46th anniversary of being sober. So even today, my mom and I sometimes sit down at the table and talk about just how lucky we are to have survived all of that. So we don't take any of those things for granted. So we feel very blessed and very, very lucky. In all reality, we feel very, very lucky that we survived all those things. So eventually, my dad came out and brought us all back from that situation, for which we were very thankful. And I eventually paid for my own college. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. So you can see a picture of my Nana, my grandmother. I've never seen her more proud in my life. But I was the first person to graduate from my family from college. Eventually, I got married, and there's a picture of me and my now ex-wife. But again, those pictures don't really show you what's behind the facade of what is really behind what the optics display.
Was that the end of the obstacles you faced?
Well, not really, Will, because after that, you have to remember I came back to central Pennsylvania. And in central Pennsylvania, particularly as a boy or a man, you didn't go to the hospital or to the doctor unless you were bleeding from the ears. So, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to really read from a list because there are just so many of these things. But I did have some other medical issues. And I really apologize, but I'm going to have to read from a list. But I'm not going to hit all of the other things. I'm going to really only hit either the major medical issues or life-threatening things. But I remember I had an aunt who always told my parents, this kid is diabetic. You've got to get him checked. But again, you didn't go to the doctor unless you were bleeding from the eyes or the ears. But I was a type 1 diabetic probably from the time I was like maybe 5 or 6 to 10 years old. But I was a type 1 diabetic. I was also misdiagnosed as a type 1 diabetic, but I didn't get diagnosed until my early 20s. But because I was diabetic for so many years without being diagnosed, I but I ended up having some other ramifications from that later. I also had muscular dystrophy, but fortunately there's only 2 types of muscular dystrophy that are not life-threatening. Fortunately, even though I was misdiagnosed at the time, but I was eventually diagnosed with one of the non-fatal forms. But then I also had macular degeneration. I had ended up having cataract surgery. I I maxed out on laser eye surgery. And when I'm saying laser eye, I'm talking about cauterizing. I had so much bleeding from my blood vessels that's what they did the laser eye surgery for. Then I had vitrectomy, which is a pretty invasive laser, or not laser, pretty invasive surgery in your eyes. I have severe neuropathy in all of my extremities. I had a couple of strokes. I had a couple of heart attacks. Had knee surgeries. I had hand surgeries, arm surgeries. I had a kidney transplant, pancreas transplant. I had severe rejection of my pancreas. I had rejection of my kidney a couple of times. I had the MRSA virus, had chronic pneumonia, acute pneumonia. I have pulmonary issues. I've got bad osteoarthritis in my back, pretty bad back problems. I now need another pancreas transplant. Now I'm also type 1 diabetic again, so I'm back to that. I also have this unknown issue where it started about a couple of years ago, where I was in a bar in Philly and I just passed out. And this creates a funny story for me, at least. They thought I was dead. They called the hospital and said, we have a dead guy on the floor of the bar. So they called the hospital and said I was dead. They were doing CPR on me when the ambulance came, but I wasn't dead. So I went to the hospital. I was in the hospital for about a week. And then about a year and a half later, I passed out again in my apartment. I woke up, had no idea where I was. So now I've got something implanted in my chest where they're doing some kind of monitoring. So that's another unknown issue. I'm going blind. I'll be blind in a few years. So I know some of you might be thinking, what's going on with this guy? Oh, this poor guy. I can't believe these things are happening. Some of you guys might be thinking, he's so interesting. My God, I can't believe it. Some of you might be thinking something completely different. But it doesn't really matter what you think. And I'm not saying it for any kind of empathy or anything like that. But regardless of those things, I was still able to accomplish some other goals because of the way I approach things. I still have won, 3 state championships. I was fortunate enough to have won, a scholarship to study abroad where I learned to speak a language fluently and to learn a culture very, very well. I was selected by top Fortune 500 company as their top national recruit, even though I did not have very good grades at all in college. I became the CEO of a public company at 39, and as Will said, there's only about a dozen of us in the country at that time. Another thing I'll tell you, which is a little embarrassing as well, I've been to jail 6 times, although none of it was my fault, mostly. Even though those challenges existed, or if you call them challenges or whatever you want to call them, there was really just one of those things that I haven't mentioned yet that I really struggled with getting around. And that was the fact that I was gay. And also, you see, the company that I ran was as industrial a business as you can imagine. We managed MRO products. We managed the supply chain for MRO products, which is maintenance, repair, and operating business or products. Anything from bearings to screwdrivers to transmissions, those kinds of products. And but I've known I was gay since I was 13. But I wrestled in one of the best wrestling high schools in the state, Pennsylvania, which is a huge wrestling state. I played tennis very competitively. I played football. I mean, I was a bit of a sports guy. And at the same time, I sang in the choir. And at the same time, I participated in musicals and things like that. So I was this odd guy in that I had these kind of dual roles. But at that time, if I would have come out when I knew I was gay, my parents would have definitely sent me away for electric shock therapy. And I'm not blaming my parents. It was the times. And it was in a small town, so you had no access to the internet. You had no access to information. And I grew up in a very religious family. The 700 Club was on 24/7 in my house. So that was accepted practice in those times. And so I don't blame my parents. It was just the way it was. Plus, it was preached in our church constantly. I remember thinking that every time they preached that in our church, which was constantly, I thought they were talking right to me. So I lived in Richmond, Virginia for a period of time, and I had this friend, well, a guy who became my friend, this artist, a very good artist, Alex Sorapuru. He practices painting where he paints, but he doesn't look at the canvas as he's painting. And Alex knew a little bit of my story, but not my whole story. And as he made this painting, he created, and he calls it The Walls We Build. And it was almost as if he knew every single thing about me. And the first wall was like a white wall. So the way I interpreted that was kind of my innocence that was stolen at a young age. But he didn't know that. So why did he choose the white as the first wall? And the one after that was red. So I kind of view that as the health issues. And why did he choose red? I don't know. And then the last wall, which was the one on the very far outside, was a deep, deep purple. And I kind of view that as the fact that I was gay. That was the toughest one for me to overcome. And then beyond that, I was so suicidal, probably from the time I was 14 until I was 46. And the only reason I say I was 46, that's when I had my pancreas transplant. And my pancreas transplant surgeon, who today is a good friend of mine, Knock Tai, Knock had told me every person he does a pancreas transplant on no longer is suicidal after he does a pancreas transplant. So there's no doubt in my mind that a piece of that has to do with just mentally, I mean, knowing that I was gay and struggling with that piece of it. But there's no doubt in my mind that there's a chemical piece in there as well. So that's a little bit of my story there.
Don, that's a fair amount of issues to carry as an adult, let alone a child. How did you get around all of those obstacles?
Well, it's taken me a long time, Will, to kind of figure out how how I was able to not only navigate those things, but how to really conquer those things. Because I'm all about not only identifying those issues, but because of my competitive spirit, I'm really a competitive guy. But how do I beat them? So, and then I'm also a guy who's good at compartmentalizing. And I think, I was so fortunate because I also recognized, although not until I was in my 30s, but I recognized that I needed help through a therapist or somebody like that. Thank goodness I recognized that I went to see the person. But much like I did with the issues that I had, I was able to compartmentalize things. But that's what I also do with the way I manage things. So I compartmentalized the way I was able to combat these issues. So what I did was I put them in sort of buckets. And the first thing was acceptance. And some of these things I was able to do even like at 19 years old, which I look back and I think, how did I know that at such a young age? But acceptance is one of the first things you have to do. So the first two things that I really had to accept, and I can tell you, the toughest thing for me to accept was the fact that I was gay. I didn't come out of the closet until I was 48. I didn't accept the fact that I was gay until I was 49. So even though I came out of the closet at 48, I didn't accept that until I was 49. I had to accept the fact that I was diabetic and that I had muscular dystrophy when I was 22. It was easy for me to accept those things, but I couldn't accept the fact that I was gay until I was 49. But acceptance is one of the first things you have to do. You just have to accept the hand you're dealt. That's the first thing. The second thing that I think is really important is your attitude. So when you go into a transplant situation, you've got to have the right attitude. I think attitude's about 80% of it. It's not 100% because you have to have good surgeons, but it's about 80% of it. The other piece is humor. You got to have a great sense of humor, and you have to find humor in just about everything. And like I said, Humor is not dismissive of the issue, but if you can't find humor in things, it's a bit of a lost cause. So you got to make sure it's not a dismissive piece of the equation, but you've got to find humor in things. The other is perspective. So, for example, you never, ever, ever forget where you came from. So, for example, today, because I was so lucky to have such a great career, I will never forget when we lived in Watts. There was not my best friend, but one of my best friends when I was there was this little black guy and little kid. I mean, we were just little kids, 6 and 7 years old. He used to eat paste. We had paste, which is like glue, but it was a solid material. I don't know how to describe it. I remember one time trying to describe it to you, Will, but it was, I can't remember even the consistency, but if you know what paste is. But he used to eat that on a piece of paper. And I remember other kids making fun of him because of that. And I used to get mad at these other kids for making fun of him. But now looking back at that as an adult, I was thinking it might have been really the only source of nourishment he had during the day. Who knows? And, today I drive a relatively nice car, and it's rare's the time that I'm not driving on the highway when I don't think of that little guy. And my only hope is that he's not driving a nice car on a highway, hopefully in California or wherever he is, thinking about me. But I think of that guy very frequently. And I just hope he made it out of there. I mean, you don't know who made out of there and who didn't. But you keep things in perspective. It's important that you have a support network. You never blame other people. I remember at 18, pardon me. When I was about 18 and 19 years old, I used to blame everybody. I blamed my parents. I blamed everybody for everything. But about 19 years old, I remember thinking, it's about time you pull your own pants up and you stop blaming people. From today forward, you've got to take responsibility for yourself. You can't blame anybody else ever again. So you got to stop blaming other people. You never be a victim. That's a critically important thing. If you become a victim, then you give power to everybody else. You cannot be a victim. And the other thing is you just can't give up. You just can never give up. Once you give up, you've lost everything. You just can't give up. And then the last piece, which is one of the important things of our discussion today, is the mentorship you receive. Now, mentorship has two pieces to it. One is the personal side of mentorship, and the other is the professional side. So today we're going to really talk about the professional side of mentorship. And in that piece, I was just such a lucky guy to have received the kind of mentorship that I received. Now, even as a kid, I remember thinking I was a bit of an unusual kid because I never had a hero. Many of my friends had heroes, whether it was Larry Boa, Larry Zonka. Now I'm going to date myself or try and bring it to newer standards, Danny Marino, who's still an older guy, but they had heroes. I didn't have any heroes, but one of the things on a personal basis, whether I liked a person or not, they may have had traits that I agreed with. So I would take a person and I would identify a trait that they would have, and I would try and emulate that trait. And then I would amalgamate all those different traits and try and create an imaginary person who would have all those traits. And I would try and put that person together and identify that person that I would put together, that I would try and make the person that I wanted to be.
So how did you find a mentor?
Well, that's a great question, Will. I never, because I really reflected on that, particularly as we went into this webinar, and I don't really remember ever actively looking for a mentor. So as I went back and I thought, Bruce Edwards, who was the CEO of DHL, he was my first mentor. I remember thinking back, did I really actively look for a mentor, and how did Bruce and I really connect? And so as I looked back, I mean, Bruce and I started with the same company, and we started about 2 weeks at the same. I mean, we started 2 weeks with each other with the same company, but he obviously started at a much different level than I did. Uh, Bruce and I had some common interests, so we both played tennis competitively, and there were some different things where our paths crossed at different times. We shared some common interests, and then but I never really was actively looking for a mentor, but I was always definitely open for a mentor. So I think humility is one of the important things. You need to make sure that you are definitely humble and open for a mentor. I think that's one of the things you definitely have to be. I think you need to make sure that when you're open and humble and looking for a mentor, you make sure that people know that you're open to it. But you also want to make sure that if you identify somebody who you would like to be your mentor, that you identify areas where you've got commonality with that person. Um, in my case, for example, with Bruce, I was fortunate that we did share some commonality, not only within the business, but outside of that in other areas like tennis, for example, and sports. So I thought he saw in me, A, that I was competitive. I think fortunately he also saw in me a work ethic, a strong work ethic. I think he saw in me, probably some level of intellect. I think he saw in me my approach to business that probably emulated his approach to business. Then I think because we shared some common interests, that probably brought us closer together. Then I was very fortunate. There was a period of time where I worked for him directly. Then I was very, very fortunate that we were working on the largest deal for DHL at the time, which was a piece of business for our largest North American client, which was the biggest sales deal in the company's history, which happened to be in Mexico. I happened to have lived in Mexico and spoke the language fluently. And in that sales deal, I learned so much from Bruce, not only during that time, but across my career. But in that process, we decided to have me do a piece of the sales presentation in Spanish. And then I also got to meet with the P&G representatives, who were these younger, very bright salespeople, or not salespeople, but the representatives from Procter & Gamble from Mexico City, who I got along with great. Now, also, if you take a look at those people, one of the guys is the CEO of Solistica, who's a very large, he's the CEO of Solistica, who's one of the largest Latin American third-party logistics companies. Another guy, Nacho Sordo, he was the CIO of all of Latin American P&G business. He was also the temporary CIO for the equivalent of Mexico's MIT. So hugely successful guys from P&G in Mexico. So those were some of the ways that I ended up being the mentor for Bruce. And then I went to work for SDI, who I became the CEO for, and I worked with Ron Whitaker. And I was just so lucky to work for Ron Whitaker, but Ron was a well-known turnaround CEO. Well, what I learned from Bruce Edwards was quality and the quality process. But what I learned from Ron Whitaker was very different from Bruce, because Ron was a turnaround CEO. Very different set of skills. So while I was so fortunate to learn from Bruce, what I learned from him was constrained by Bruce's skill set and his experience base. What I learned from Ron was totally different from that. And then Ron typically stays with a business 2 or 3 years and then moves on, which he did. And then I worked for Bruce, or for Bill Berkeley. Bill was a guy who started a company years ago that today it's a Fortune 500 business. And Bruce is also one of the Forbes 400. Bill's a great guy, but I learned so much from Bill. Bill is a risk taker, a measured risk taker. And sometimes he's a measured risk taker, and other times he really takes much more of a risk. But he knows that. I mean, you can't build a business from nothing to an $8 billion a year business without taking risk. So when you take a look, and then I worked also with Bob Neary. Bob used to be the co-chairman of Ernst & Young. Bob has much more of a financial background, so that's the way he learns. So for me to have the ability to have learned from all four of those gentlemen has been enormously, exponentially more valuable than to have learned from each one of those individually. And then to have exposure to the people on the board of directors that I've learned from has been outstanding. So that's why having exposure to those people has done nothing but made me know that one-to-many relationship and feedback mechanism is so much more valuable than a one-to-one.
It looks like you got a lot more from having more mentors than one single mentor, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Well, there's just zero doubt about that. And that's why I was just saying I probably got a little bit ahead of that. But there's zero doubt that a one-to-many relationship is so much more valuable than a one-to-one relationship. And so when I put together this Mentorship.CLUB business, every one of these very bright mentors, to do mentorship right takes a ton of time. And in order for a person of this level to really spend the time with a mentor, they need to know that mentor or mentee, they need to make sure that mentee is vetted. And that's one of the things that we do. We make sure that the mentee is vetted. So we have a vetting process. So if that mentee is vetted and that mentor is of a great caliber and that mentee asks a question. So for example, say if it's somebody who's starting a business up in the fashion industry and they check it's a startup and it's a fashion industry, et cetera, and they can ask a question and they say it's the fashion industry, it's a startup, they might get the question answered by Stephanie von Wadsdorf, who's really one of my best friends ever. Stephanie started up a company called Fig.com. Steph used to work for Tory Burch. She used to work for Ralph Lauren. She's been written up in Wall Street Journal so many times. Steph just started up a company called Fig, so she knows about how to start up a company, how to start it up to look for capital. So she would answer the question. Catherine Petralia. Catherine is voted as one of the 100 most powerful women in the world by Forbes. So she started a company called Cabbage. So maybe she would answer the question. Vicky Cantrell, who's one of the most well-known people in the retail industry. You might get the answer from Vicky. So for somebody who's starting up a business in the fashion industry to get a response by those three women would be invaluable. And from those three different perspectives, imagine that versus getting a one-to-one relationship from somebody who's not even as competent as those three people. So, of course, it's so much more valuable than a one-to-one relationship. The other thing is fear of failure drives you so much, but so does fear of success. And that's something I had to learn the hard way. Fear of success sometimes drives you sometimes to a little bit of failure. And that's also a scary thing. And there's a saying out there that I learned of recently that as I look back, that's really driven me, even though I didn't know the saying, it's something that's really driven me a lot. And that is, if you can't beat fear, then do it scared. And I've done that so many times in my life. If you can't beat fear, do it scared. I do things scared all the time.
I love that. So how have you
That's
decided to pass on the mentorship you've received to others?
Well, part of it is as our relationship has developed. Part of it, I mentor you. I mentor some other people. Like one guy I mentor is a guy out of Scotland, Lewis McDonald. Lewis is a great guy. In fact, I give Lewis credit for me starting this business as well. So one day I was talking to Lewis, and I met Lewis in a very unusual manner. But Lewis is such a bright guy. Lewis is, I think, 26 years old. And I had this discussion with Lewis, just in a regular mentoring process. And Lewis said to me, well, Don, what is your purpose? And that set me back on my heels because I've had people ask me what's my purpose or what's my passion. That's an easy answer. But Lewis asked me, what's my purpose? And I said, well, Lewis, I'm going to have to get back to you on that because I really had to think, what's my purpose? My purpose, my purpose, my purpose. So as I thought about what's my purpose, and I really had to think about what's my purpose on this life. So when I die, what do I want my purpose to have been? So I had to really think back to my history and back to everything that's transpired in my life. And what do I really want my purpose to have been? And I worked with another guy, actually a guy named Tim. Tim used to be the president of Suntory Beam, all of the well-known Maker's Mark, Jim Beam, all the well-known alcohol brands worldwide. And Tim one time said to me, Don, I think you'll teach people someday, regardless of whatever else you'll do. I think you will teach people someday. And that really stuck with me. And I think that was really my purpose. So I came back to Lewis later. And I said to Lewis, I think someday that'll be my purpose. And that's part of why I started this business.
Well, that's great. So before we move on, did you want to share a little bit about what's in store moving forward with our next webinars?
Well, yeah, I think there's going to be a couple of critical things and important things. One, because of this global crisis, I think, there's a couple things. One, because of the global crisis, I've been fortunate or unfortunate to have worked through some other global crises. One was with M&M Mars, where we had to change global production schedules. So I will be able to share some of those learnings on the global crises to help other people through this global crisis. The other thing will be to understand some of those other things that I've talked about, whether it's humor or the other things that you identified too in our process before about how to overcome obstacles. We'll have other webinars on those things as well. So we have a lot of exciting new webinars coming up here, not later this month, but starting in January.
Well, it sounds like we should take some questions now. Let's see here. We have